My sister-in-law grabbed my 8-year-old daughter's arm hard enough to leave bruises, screamed in front of 50 parents and teachers that she was a cheater, and tried to snatch the first-place ribbon right off her chest. She believed that being family gave her immunity from consequences. She believed that I would swallow my rage the way I always had, smile, and let it go for the sake of keeping the peace. She was catastrophically wrong. I had the bruises photographed, a police report filed, and an eviction notice drafted before she finished her second glass of wine that night. The drive home from Maplewood Elementary was one of the longest of my life, and it was only 6 minutes. Sophie sat in the back seat, her painting still rolled under her arm, the red first-place ribbon crumpled in her small fist. She wasn't crying. That was the part that undid me. Sophie was the kind of kid who cried at commercials with dogs in them, who tore up when a plant died in our kitchen. But right now, she was just staring out the window at the passing streetlights with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was the expression of a child who had just learned that the world was not the safe place she thought it was. I white-knuckled the steering wheel and kept my voice even. "Does your arm hurt, baby?" She looked down at the marks, 4 distinct red ovals along her forearm, where my sister-in-law's fingers had dug in. "A little," she said. "It feels hot." I pulled into the driveway of our townhouse, turned off the engine, and sat there for 10 seconds with my eyes closed. I was 31 years old. I was a licensed general contractor. I had built things from nothing, managed job sites full of men twice my age and half my patience, and negotiated contracts with people who thought a woman with a tool belt was a joke. I knew how to stay cold when everything in me wanted to burn. I was going to need every bit of that skill tonight. Inside, I got Sophie settled on the couch with an ice pack and her favorite show. I took photos of her arm from 4 different angles in good lighting. I texted them immediately to my own email and backed them up to the cloud. Then I poured myself a glass of water I didn't drink and called my brother. He picked up on the second ring. "Lauren, hey, look." "Don't," I said. "Tell me you saw what your wife did to Sophie tonight." There was a long pause. I could hear the television in the background at his place. I could hear my sister-in-law's voice somewhere behind him, low and tense, coaching him through the wall. "I saw it got heated," Ryan said carefully. "Diane is really upset. Connor worked so hard on his project, and she feels like the judging wasn't fair." She grabbed my daughter's arm in front of the entire school gymnasium, I said. "Sophie is 8 years old. There are bruises, Ryan. 4 finger-shaped bruises." Another silence. This one heavier. I'm sure she didn't mean to grab her that hard. She was emotional. And there it was, the sentence that told me everything. Not, "Is Sophie okay?" Not, "I'm so sorry, that was wrong." Just the reflex to protect Diane and manage me. My brother was a good man underneath all of it. I genuinely believed that. But he had spent 5 years in a marriage that had slowly trained him to absorb his wife's anger and redirect it outward, to smooth over her chaos, so his own life could stay calm. He had forgotten that his calm was being purchased on credit, and the bill had just come due. "I'll talk to her," Ryan said. "We can all sit down tomorrow and—" "Sophie is going to urgent care," I said. "Tonight, I'm documenting the injury, and then I'm going to the police station." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. When Ryan spoke again, his voice had dropped to something urgent and private, like he was stepping out of the room. "Lauren, come on. You can't call the cops on family. Diane made a mistake. If you file a police report, it follows her forever." She should have thought about that before she put her hands on a child. I hung up before he could say anything else. 20 minutes later, Sophie and I were sitting in the waiting room of the urgent care on Birchwood Avenue. I had chosen this particular clinic deliberately. Not the one where my crew had done the tenant improvement build-out 6 months ago, where the front desk staff all knew my name and my face. I wanted strangers. I wanted a paper trail made by people with no reason to soften anything. The physician assistant, a young woman with tired eyes who introduced herself as Dana, took one look at Sophie's arm and went very still, in the professional way that people in medical fields go still when they are absorbing something serious. She documented everything: the shape of the bruising, the diameter of the marks, the mild swelling along 2 of the impression points. She said the word patterned, and she said the word consistent, and she wrote both of them down. Given the nature of the injury, Dana said gently, looking from Sophie to me, I'm required to ask, is there anything going on at home? It happened at a school event, I said. My sister-in-law did this. I have the incident on partial video from another parent's phone. I'm filing a police report tonight. Dana nodded and kept writing. She offered to include her own photos for the file, and I told her yes, please. My phone was buzzing continuously. I pulled it out under the exam table and looked at the screen without opening anything. 8 missed calls from Ryan. 3 texts from Diane. I took a screenshot of the notification screen, showing the volume and timestamp of contact. Then I opened Diane's messages. The first one read, "You're making a mountain out of a molehill." I barely touched her. Sophie was being a little show-off, and Connor is devastated. If you had any idea how hard he worked, you'd understand why I reacted. The second one read, "Call me back before you do something stupid. We can handle this as a family." The third one arrived while I was reading. "I swear to God, Lauren, if you go to the police over this, I will make your life very difficult. You know things about your business that wouldn't look good if someone asked questions. Think about what you're doing." I read that last text 4 times. Then I forwarded all 3 to my email, backed them up, and screenshot the thread. The first 2 texts were evidence of a lack of remorse. The third one was a threat, and it had just upgraded my evening from a police report to a police report and a conversation with my attorney. Sophie fell asleep on the drive to the police station. She was small and exhausted, and she still had the crumpled ribbon in her lap even while she slept. I carried her inside, and the officer at the front desk, a heavy-set man named Officer Garza with a kind face, got us into an interview room within 5 minutes. To understand why Diane had reached the point of grabbing a child in a school gymnasium full of witnesses, you have to understand the architecture of our family dynamic over the past 5 years, because it didn't happen overnight. It was a structure built 1 brick at a time. My brother Ryan and I had been close our whole lives. We grew up without much money and with parents who loved us but worked constantly, which meant Ryan and I learned early to rely on each other. I was the practical one. I learned to fix things, to build things, to figure out how systems worked. By the time I was 27, I had my contractor's license, a small but profitable renovation business, and enough saved to put a down payment on a duplex on the east side of town. I lived in 1 unit. I rented the other to Ryan and Diane at $500 below market rate because Ryan's sales job had hit a dry patch and Diane didn't work outside the home. That was 3 years ago. The dry patch had become a valley. Ryan's income had stabilized, but Diane had grown accustomed to the arrangement. They were paying me $1,200 a month for a unit that I could have rented for $1,750. I told myself family helps family, and I genuinely believed it. I was wrong to believe it had been received in the spirit it was given. Diane was not a bad person in the way that truly dangerous people are bad. She wasn't malicious from the start. She was insecure in a way that had calcified over years into something harder and more corrosive. Her entire identity lived inside her son Connor. He was 10 years old, bright-eyed, and absolutely ordinary in the best possible way. A kid who loved building things out of cardboard and watching nature documentaries and eating cereal for dinner when Ryan let him. But Diane needed him to be exceptional. She needed him to be the proof of something she couldn't name out loud. She signed him up for every enrichment class available, spent more money than they had on tutors and programs, and evaluated every achievement against whoever happened to be nearby. Sophie was nearby. Sophie was my daughter. She was 8 going on 40, intensely observant, quietly creative, and completely uninterested in competition. She made art because she loved to make art, the way some kids breathe. She didn't enter the Maplewood Elementary Spring Art Showcase to beat anyone. She entered because her teacher, Mrs. Park, asked her to, and because she had been working on a watercolor of the creek behind our townhouse for 3 months, and she wanted someone besides me to see it. Connor had entered a pencil sketch of a race car. It was a good sketch for a 10-year-old. The judges, 3 local art teachers with no connection to the school, gave him 2nd place in the upper elementary division. They gave Sophie 1st place in the lower elementary division. That was enough. I had been standing across the gymnasium, talking to another parent, when I heard the commotion. I turned to see Diane bent at the waist, her face inches from Sophie's, her voice cutting and loud enough to carry over the ambient noise of 100 people. "You think you're so talented? You think this was fair? The judges made a mistake. Everyone here knows you don't deserve this." Sophie had taken a step back and bumped into the display table. She looked small and confused, still holding the ribbon, trying to process why her aunt was doing this. When she turned to walk toward me, Diane grabbed her arm. I was moving before I fully understood what I was seeing. By the time I reached them, another parent had already stepped between them, a woman named Mrs. Holloway whose daughter was in Sophie's class. Mrs. Holloway had a hand on Diane's shoulder and a very controlled expression on her face. Diane let go of Sophie's arm. The damage was already done. I took Sophie's hand and looked at my sister-in-law. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with something between fury and the dawning awareness that she had just made a very public mistake. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I looked at her the way I look at a load-bearing wall before I tell a homeowner it needs to come down. "We're leaving," I said. "Lauren, I was just..." "Don't," I said, and I walked out with my daughter. Officer Garza was thorough and unhurried. He separated Sophie and me for part of the interview, which I had been told was standard procedure, and those 15 minutes alone in the hallway, studying a community bulletin board, were among the loneliest of my life. I kept reminding myself that Sophie was safe, that the people on the other side of that door were trying to help her, that the best thing I could do for my daughter right now was hold the line. When he brought me back in, he had Sophie's account written up, and he showed it to me without comment. She had described everything clearly, calmly, and in exactly the sequence it happened. Kids that age don't have the narrative construction to invent details like that. Her account was the account of someone telling the truth. Officer Garza looked at the photos of her arm, looked at the urgent care paperwork, and looked at the forwarded texts on my phone, including the one where Diane had referenced my business. "This last message," he said, tapping the screen. "The one about your business. Do you know what she's referring to?" I thought about it for a moment. "I don't know specifically. My business is licensed and clean, but she may be trying to suggest she'd file a complaint with the contractor's board or make something up to damage my reputation. It's a threat." He nodded slowly. "That combined with the physical evidence, the documentation from urgent care, and the lack of remorse in the earlier messages, gives us enough to move forward on a charge of simple assault and battery on a minor. The third message could also be relevant to a harassment filing." He set down his pen. "I want to ask you about your immediate safety. Is there any reason to believe she'd escalate tonight? They live 40 feet away from me," I thought. "In my building, in a unit I own, in a lease that was already in breach." I drove home at midnight with Sophie asleep in the back seat. I carried her to bed and tucked her in, and stood in her doorway for a long moment watching her breathe. Then I went to my office, opened my fireproof filing cabinet, and pulled out the folder marked Duplex Unit B Lease Agreement. I had drafted it myself with help from a real estate attorney 3 years ago. It was a standard month-to-month residential lease, with a clause I had included almost as an afterthought because my attorney had recommended it. Section 11. Tenant Conduct. Tenant shall not engage in any activity that constitutes a nuisance, harassment, or unlawful conduct directed toward the landlord, other tenants, or the landlord's immediate family. Violation of this clause constitutes grounds for immediate termination of tenancy with appropriate notice. My sister-in-law had physically assaulted my daughter. She had made a veiled threat against my livelihood via text message. Both acts were documented. Both acts were directed at the landlord's immediate family. I read the clause 3 times, and then I opened my laptop and wrote an email to my real estate attorney. The subject line was, "Emergency lease violation and notice to vacate Unit B, 1718 Halcyon Drive." I laid out everything in precise chronological order. I attached the urgent care documents, the photos, the police report number, and the screenshot of Diane's texts. I asked for a 30-day notice to vacate on grounds of nuisance and unlawful activity. I hit send at 12:47 a.m., and then I sat at my desk in the dark and let myself shake for exactly 3 minutes. The confrontation happened the next morning. I hadn't slept. I was on my second cup of coffee when I heard the knock, and then the knock became a pounding, and the pounding became a doorbell held down with a thumb that had no intention of letting go. I checked the security feed on my phone. Ryan. He looked like he'd been up all night too, and unlike me, he hadn't spent the night organizing evidence. He'd spent it being managed by his wife. I stepped outside onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me. The morning was cold and gray, the kind of late spring morning that hadn't gotten the memo that winter was over. Ryan reached for a hug out of reflex, and I stepped back. He froze the way people freeze when they reach for something solid and find air. He looked older than he had yesterday. The lines around his eyes were deeper. "Lauren, please," he said. "The police showed up at my door last night. Diane was up all night. She's terrified." "She should have thought about that before she grabbed an 8-year-old, I said. "She has never done anything like this before." "She has absolutely done things like this before," I said, keeping my voice level. "She has spent 3 years chipping away at my daughter. Every holiday, every school event, every time Sophie achieves something, this is just the first time she did it with an audience." Ryan rubbed the back of his neck, the gesture he always used when he knew someone was right and couldn't bring himself to say so. "She's not a violent person, Lauren. She's a stressed-out mother who lost her temper. She left bruises on a child's arm and then texted me a threat." He blinked. "What threat?" I pulled out my phone and showed him. He read the third text twice. Something shifted in his face, a quiet, involuntary reordering of something he had been holding together with willpower. "She wrote that? She wrote that. And I showed it to Officer Garza last night along with everything else." Ryan handed the phone back. He sat down on the porch step because his legs seemed to stop working. He put his head in his hands, and I felt the old grief for the brother I grew up with, the person he was before he had reorganized himself around the task of surviving life with Diane. "I can't drop the charges," I told him. "The city picked them up, but even if I could, I wouldn't. And there's something else you need to know." He looked up. "I spoke to my attorney this morning. I'm serving a 30-day notice to vacate. Diane violated Section 11 of the lease. The physical assault and the threatening text are both documented violations." The color drained from his face in a way that I had only ever seen in people receiving a terminal diagnosis. "Lauren, we can't. Sophie's school is here. This neighborhood is our whole life. We have nowhere to go." "Then you should have stopped her years ago," I said, not unkindly. "You knew what she was doing. You saw the little comments at Christmas. You saw the way she talked about Sophie's grades, her art, her clothes. You watched it, and you said nothing because it was easier than the fight." He didn't deny it. "You have 30 days, I said. "And Ryan, I say this as your sister. Get a lawyer, not for the eviction, for yourself." I went back inside before he could answer. What followed was a 3-week education in how a person with no real power weaponizes the perception of power. Diane couldn't undo the police report. She couldn't reattach the photographs to her version of events. She couldn't make the urgent care documentation say something different. So she went to the place where none of that mattered, the court of neighborhood opinion. It started with a post in the Maplewood family's Facebook group. She didn't name me. She was careful about that, the way people are careful when they know enough to be scared of direct liability. But she wrote about a vindictive family member who had used a moment of parental emotion to weaponize the legal system, who was trying to destroy a mother for protecting her child, who was using financial power to bully people who were already struggling. The comment section filled up with people who had never met me, offering support and solidarity. Then came the contractors board. I found out about it on a Tuesday afternoon when I got an automated notification from the California Contractors State License Board that an anonymous complaint had been filed against my license number. The complaint alleged that I had accepted cash payments off the books on 3 renovation projects over the past 2 years and failed to report the income. It was a lie. Every transaction I had ever conducted was documented, invoiced, and reported. My bookkeeper could verify every dollar. But a complaint was a complaint, and the board was required to investigate, which meant paperwork, delays on pending permits, and potential complications with a commercial project I had scheduled to begin the following month. I called my attorney before I even finished reading the notification email. She was quiet for a moment after I finished explaining, the silence of someone making calculations. "The complaint is dated 2 days after you served the eviction notice," she said. "I know. And the threat in the text about your business. I know. Lauren, this is becoming a pattern of harassment. You know that, right?" I knew. I also knew that a pattern of harassment, combined with the original assault and the eviction, was going to make for a very complete file at the permanent restraining order hearing. "Add it to the stack," I said. "I want everything at the hearing." The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I had spent 2 weeks building a case file with my attorney that was meticulous in the way that only someone who has spent a decade managing construction projects with thousands of moving parts can build a case file. Every document dated. Every piece of evidence labeled. Every incident, in chronological order, with a corresponding attachment. I arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes early. I wore a blazer I had bought specifically for this occasion, not because I thought clothing won cases, but because I wanted Sophie to see that her mother had walked into that room prepared and composed. Diane came in with a court-appointed attorney who looked stretched thin across too many cases. She had dressed herself carefully, a pale pink blouse, flat shoes, her hair pulled back softly. She looked like a kindergarten teacher. She looked like someone's quiet, reasonable mother. She did not look like a woman who had grabbed a child in a gymnasium or threatened a licensed contractor in writing, or filed a fraudulent complaint with a regulatory board. The judge was a man in his late 50s named Judge Carrasco, who had the permanently tired expression of someone who had seen every variety of human conflict and was not particularly surprised by any of them. Diane's attorney went first. He spoke about an isolated incident, a moment of maternal stress, about the complicated dynamics of blended family competition, about the disproportionate response of a landlord using an eviction as a financial weapon against a struggling family. He was competent and underprepared. He was working from a single sheet of notes. My attorney had 3 binders. She presented the urgent care documentation first. She walked Judge Carrasco through the physician assistant's notes, the clinical language about patterned bruising and impression points, the photographs. She let the photographs speak for 30 seconds of silence. Then she moved to the texts. She put Diane's 3 messages on the screen at the front of the courtroom in large font. The third one, "You know things about your business that wouldn't look good if someone asked questions," sat there on the wall like a confession. Then she presented the contractor's board complaint. She showed the timestamp, 2 days after service of the eviction notice. She showed that the complaint was anonymous. She submitted a sworn affidavit from my bookkeeper, attesting to the completeness and accuracy of my financial records. She submitted a statement from the board, noting that preliminary review had found no basis for the complaint, which had been administratively closed. "Your Honor," my attorney said, "we are not here because the petitioner overreacted to a family dispute. We are here because the respondent physically harmed a child, made a documented threat against the petitioner's livelihood, and when faced with legal consequences, attempted to destroy the petitioner's professional reputation through a fraudulent regulatory complaint. This is not a mother who made one mistake under stress. This is a pattern of escalating behavior directed at the petitioner and her daughter." Judge Carrasco looked at Diane over his reading glasses. He had the still, patient expression of a man who was going to ask exactly what he wanted to know and no more. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, using her married name. "The third text message. Can you explain what you meant when you referenced the petitioner's business?" Diane's attorney started to rise. The judge raised one hand without looking at him, and the attorney sat back down. Diane smoothed the front of her blouse. "I was upset," she said. Her voice had the carefully modulated tremor of someone trying to perform distress. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't mean it as a threat. I was just venting." "You were texting," the judge said. "That is not venting. That is documentation." Diane's composure flickered. "I love Sophie," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I would never actually hurt her. Lauren is using all of this to punish me because she's always resented that Ryan chose me. She uses money to control everyone around her. She acts like because she owns the building, she owns our lives. Mrs. Brennan." The judge's voice was quiet and final. "Your husband's sister owns the building you are being evicted from because she chose to subsidize your housing for 3 years at a substantial personal loss. The fact that she is now exercising her legal rights as a property owner is not evidence of malice. It is evidence of a lease violation that you created. He turned to the gallery. Mr. Brennan, you are the father of the child in the respondent's household and the brother of the petitioner. Please stand. Ryan stood up from the bench behind Diane. He looked like a man who had been underwater for a long time and was only now approaching the surface. Is your daughter, the judge began, then corrected himself. Is your niece, Sophie, a child with a history of difficult or provocative behavior toward your son? Diane turned around. Her eyes found Ryan's with an intensity that was not a question. It was a command. Ryan looked at his wife. He looked at her for a long moment. I watched his face from across the room, and I saw something in it that I recognized, because it was the same expression I had seen when we were kids, and he used to get up in the middle of the night to check if I was okay after a nightmare. It was the face of someone who remembered who they actually were. No, Ryan said clearly. Sophie is not a difficult child. She's a good kid. She minds her own business. She was kind to Connor even when Diane made it hard for her to be. There was no provocation that night. Diane was upset that Connor placed second and Sophie placed first, and she took it out on an 8-year-old girl. He paused. I should have said something a long time ago. I'm sorry I didn't. The silence in the courtroom lasted 3 full seconds. Diane stood up. She was no longer performing distress. The careful costume of the kindergarten teacher was gone, and what was underneath it was something raw and fractured, and years in the making. You are unbelievable, she said, her voice shaking. You are standing in front of a judge and siding with her over your own wife and your own son, and you always do this. She crooks her finger, and you come running. She dangles the rent money, and you fold. Mrs. Brennan, the judge said sharply. She is the reason our son feels like he's never good enough, Diane continued, her voice climbing. Because no matter what Connor does, Sophie does it better, and Lauren makes sure everyone knows it. I was protecting my child. By grabbing another child and leaving bruises, the judge said, his voice cutting through hers like a table saw through drywall. Diane stopped. Her breathing was audible. I am granting the permanent restraining order for a period of 5 years, Judge Carrasco said. The respondent is to have no contact with the petitioner or the minor child, Sophie. This includes indirect contact through third parties. Any violation will result in immediate arrest. I am further recommending that the respondent's attorney advise her client that the filing of fraudulent regulatory complaints constitutes potential criminal harassment, and that any further incidents of that nature will be addressed accordingly. He closed his folder. The pending criminal charges will be addressed in a separate proceeding. We're adjourned. The gavel came down. Diane stood at the defendant's table, her face still, the way a structure goes still right after the load-bearing wall comes out before the ceiling makes up its mind about gravity. Ryan did not go to her. He sat on the bench in the gallery with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, and eventually he put his face in his hands the way people do when they have run completely out of something. The eviction was finalized 11 days later. I didn't go. I had my property manager handle it. She told me afterward that it had been difficult. Diane had refused to acknowledge the process server initially, and the final walkthrough had required a sheriff's deputy to be present. The unit was left in worse shape than it had ever been. Scuff marks on the walls, a broken cabinet door, a hole in the bedroom closet that had been covered with a poster and only discovered during the walkthrough. I documented everything and deducted what I needed from the security deposit and moved on. Ryan hadn't moved out with her. The day after the hearing, he had appeared at my door with a duffel bag and the expression of a man who had been holding his breath for 5 years and had just exhaled for the first time. He sat at my kitchen table and didn't make excuses. He didn't explain or justify or contextualize. He just said, I'm filing for divorce. I should have seen it sooner, and I didn't, and I'll spend the rest of my life making that right with Sophie. I made him coffee. We sat there together in the kind of silence that is full rather than empty, the silence of 2 people who have been through something terrible and are still here. The criminal case resolved about 2 months later. The evidence was clear enough that Diane's public defender advised her to take the plea. She pleaded no contest to misdemeanor battery on a minor. She received 18 months of probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and 80 hours of community service. She appealed the contractor's board complaint investigation, and when the board found nothing to substantiate it because there was nothing to substantiate, the complaint was formally dismissed, and the dismissal was added. 2. The case record. Her reputation in the Maplewood family's community didn't survive the court records becoming public. People who had filled her Facebook post with support quietly stopped responding to her messages. A few of the parents who had been in the gymnasium that night told me privately that they had known something was wrong in the moment and hadn't known how to respond. Mrs. Holloway, who had stepped between Diane and Sophie, sent me a card. I kept it. Connor flourished. That part surprised me and didn't surprise me at the same time. Ryan got primary physical custody during the separation, and within 3 weeks of living without his mother's pressure, the tight, a watchful expression that had lived on my nephew's face for as long as I could remember began to soften. He was 10 years old. He had been carrying a weight that no 10-year-old should be asked to carry. Without it, he started to breathe. He built things out of cardboard. He watched nature documentaries. He and Sophie, cautiously at first, and then with the resilience that only children have, started to be cousins again, instead of competitors. Sophie started at the district's art enrichment program in the fall. Her watercolor of the creek hung in the school hallway all summer before they rotated the display. I walked past it on back-to-school night and stopped and looked at it for a long time. She had painted the light on the water exactly right. She had always been able to see things the way they actually were, not the way someone else needed them to be. A few weeks after everything settled, we were in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, Sophie doing her homework at the table, and me going over invoices from a job site. She was quiet for a while, and then she looked up and said, "Mom, do you think she ever understood why it was wrong?" I thought about it for a moment. The honest answer was no, probably not, or at least not in any way that would change anything. But Sophie was 8, and she deserved something true without being heavy. "I think she understood the consequences," I said. "Sometimes that's the only language available." Sophie nodded slowly in the way she nodded when she was filing something away for later. Then she went back to her homework. I went back to my invoices. The morning light came through the kitchen window at an angle that was different than it had been 6 months ago, warmer and more direct, the way spring light always arrives eventually, even after the longest winter. I had learned more than I wanted to know about what people will do when they are afraid their children might be ordinary, about the violence that lives inside the need to be exceptional by comparison. I had learned that the relationships I thought I was protecting by staying quiet were already hollow, and that the only thing my silence had actually protected was the corrosion working its way through them from the inside. I drew a line. I used every tool I had: documentation, law, property rights, and the patience to wait for the evidence to speak clearly, and I held that line. Some people called it extreme. Some of them were the same people who had been watching Diane for years and saying nothing. Sophie kept making art. Connor kept drawing race cars, and then birds, and then his own face in the mirror, the way kids explore the world when someone finally stops telling them who they're supposed to be. Ryan learned what it cost him to stay quiet, and he was paying that debt in small daily installments of honesty that I believed, eventually, would clear. And the unit that Ryan and Diane had left behind, I repainted it, repaired the wall, replaced the cabinet door, and rented it to a graduate student named James, who thanked me with a handwritten note on his first day. He slid it under my door. It said, "This place is perfect. I can't believe how lucky I am." Neither could I, actually. In the end, none of it felt like victory. Victory implied a clean, bright finish line with no cost on the other side. What it felt like was closer to what happens when you finally remove something infected. The relief is real, and so is the scar, and you carry both of them forward because there is no other way to go. The only person still insisting she'd done nothing wrong was the person who had done it. And that, I had learned, was usually how it went.